Have you ever noticed just how often we feel the need to explain ourselves? It happens almost without thinking. We explain why we're late, why we're tired, why we turned down an invitation. We explain why we didn't reply to a message right away, or why we've been quiet, or why we suddenly changed our minds. And it goes deeper still. We even explain our emotions. Instead of simply saying we're sad, we cover it up with, "I'm just stressed." Instead of admitting we feel angry, we smooth it over with, "I'm just tired." These little justifications slip into our conversations every day, so naturally that most of the time we don't even realize we're doing it. On the surface, it seems harmless. After all, what could be wrong with being polite? With clarifying? With showing consideration for others by making sure they're not misinterpreting us? But Carl Gustav Jung, the father of analytical psychology, saw something much deeper in this constant need to justify ourselves. He believed it wasn't just a habit of communication, it was a symptom, a sign of a psychic wound that runs far beneath the surface. Because behind every explanation, no matter how casual it seems, there is an invisible message. I can only exist if you allow me. In other words, I must keep proving my worth, rationalizing my feelings, and justifying my choices. Otherwise, I risk being misunderstood, rejected, or even abandoned. This invisible message is what makes the compulsion to explain so powerful and so damaging at the same time. It trains us to live not from our truth, but from our fear of disapproval. And when we live this way long enough, we stop even noticing the prison we're building around ourselves. Life becomes a stage. Every word, every action, every feeling becomes a performance where the audience, the people around us, hold more power than the protagonist, ourselves. Jung believed this was one of the greatest obstacles to individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are. As long as we're trapped in explanations, we remain disconnected from the self, the deeper center of wholeness within us. And so, the real question becomes, what happens when we stop? When we resist the urge to explain, when we allow silence to take the place of justification, when we no longer beg for permission to exist? Jung's answer is both challenging and transformative. Because when you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. Most of us don't even realize how deeply the habit of explaining ourselves has become woven into our lives. It feels natural, automatic, like part of everyday conversation. We explain our moods to friends, telling them why we're quiet or why we don't feel like joining in. We explain our boundaries at work, justifying why we said no to an extra task or why we need more time. We even explain our decisions to people who never asked, as if their silent judgment might already be upon us. Think about how often you've caught yourself saying, "I didn't mean to upset you. I was only joking," or "I'm not angry. I've just had a long day." On the surface, these phrases look like courtesy, like you're smoothing over rough edges, preventing conflict and keeping the peace. But according to Carl Jung, they are signs of something much deeper. He believed this compulsion to justify and rationalize is not true empathy, but rather a disguised form of self-abandonment. Each time we rush to explain ourselves, what we are really saying is, "I cannot trust that my feelings, my choices, or my silence are valid unless you agree with them." It is a subtle performance meant to control how others perceive us, to soften their judgment, or to prevent rejection before it even has a chance to occur. And because this habit hides itself in everyday politeness, it feels almost invisible. We don't see the prison we are building, but the consequences are profound. Over time, the simple act of constant explaining reshapes how we move through life. We stop living from our truth and start living for the comfort of others. We no longer act because something feels right to us. Instead, we act in ways that can be justified to those around us. We stop speaking directly from our emotions and instead translate them into rational terms that will seem more acceptable. And slowly, without even noticing, we hand over our authority, Our sense of worth becomes tied to whether others understand us, agree with us, or give us permission to be. This is why Jung saw compulsive explanation as such a dangerous pattern. It transforms life into a kind of theater where we are the actors and everyone else becomes the audience. The audience's reactions, real or imagined, begin to dictate every line we speak, every move we make. The tragic irony is that the more we explain, the less we actually live for ourselves. To understand why we explain ourselves so much, we have to go back to where this pattern usually begins, childhood. Because no one is born feeling the need to justify their emotions. A child cries because they are sad, they laugh because they are happy, they shout because they are angry. At first, the expression is simple, direct, unfiltered. But then something happens. The world begins to send a different message. A child says, "I'm scared," and the parent replies, "Don't be silly, there's nothing to be afraid of." A child cries and hears, "Stop being dramatic." A child shows anger and is told, "Don't be so difficult." With each response, the child is taught that their inner world isn't trustworthy, that their emotions are too much, too messy, too inconvenient. The lesson becomes clear: what I feel only matters if others approve of it. Over time, the child begins to adapt. Instead of trusting their feelings, they look outward, searching for clues about what is acceptable. If they can explain themselves well enough, maybe they won't be punished. If they can justify their behavior, maybe they won't be ignored. And so a strategy forms, a defense mechanism designed to survive in an environment that repeatedly invalidates them. By the time this child becomes an adult, the pattern is already second nature. They don't just explain big decisions, they explain everything. Why they're quiet, why they changed their mind, why they said no, why they're upset, even why they're happy. The need to explain has become an invisible thread running through nearly every interaction, as if every thought and emotion must first pass through an approval process before being allowed into the world. Carl Jung understood this as one of the deepest psychic wounds a person can carry. He believed that compulsive self-explanation is not just a behavioral quirk, but a symptom of early emotional invalidation. It is the mark of someone who was never allowed to simply feel, who learned that their worth depended on being understood, and who now carries that burden into every relationship. This wound creates dependency on the gaze of others, a dependence so strong that it can overshadow one's own inner authority. And this is why the compulsion to explain is so difficult to break. It's not just about being polite. It's about survival. It's about a child's desperate attempt to avoid rejection, carried unconsciously into adulthood. And until it is confronted, this wound continues to whisper the same message. You are only safe if you can explain yourself well enough. Living with the constant urge to explain yourself might seem harmless at first, even considerate. But over time, this behavior carries a heavy psychological cost. It begins quietly. You justify a decision here, rationalize a feeling there, but gradually it erodes the foundation of your inner life. Each explanation chips away at your autonomy, shifting the center of your choices from within yourself to the expectations of others. Instead of asking, "What feels true for me?" you begin asking, "What will they think if I do this? How can I phrase this so it makes sense to them?" Your life becomes less about living authentically and more about defending every step you take. The result is a subtle but devastating loss of psychological freedom. When you explain yourself constantly, you stop trusting your inner authority. You no longer see your feelings and decisions as valid in themselves. Instead, they are only valid if they can be justified, packaged, and delivered in a way that others will accept. Slowly, without noticing, you become dependent on their understanding to feel secure. And once you're trapped in that cycle, you are no longer living for yourself. You're living for the audience you imagine around you. Carl Jung described this state as a form of submission. Every explanation, no matter how small, becomes a quiet act of surrender. I will reshape my truth so that it fits your comfort. On the outside, this may look like harmony. You appear agreeable, cooperative, easy to get along with. But inside, it creates a silent exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly editing yourself, of never being able to rest in your own truth. Over time, this inner split can lead to serious consequences. Anxiety grows because you're always anticipating the judgment of others. Decisions become harder because you're weighing not only what you want, but how you'll justify it. Boundaries weaken because saying no feels impossible without an elaborate explanation. Even self-esteem suffers because every time you explain, you reinforce the idea that your existence alone is not enough, that it must always be defended. This is why Jung saw compulsive explanation as one of the greatest obstacles to individuation, the process of becoming whole. Because as long as you are performing for others, you cannot truly hear yourself. You cannot live from the self, the deeper center of your being, if every thought and feeling is filtered through the fear of rejection. And that is the true cost, the loss of a life lived authentically, replaced by a life performed for the comfort of others. If compulsive explanation robs us of our freedom, then the path to healing lies in reclaiming it. For Carl Jung, this path was captured in one of his most important ideas, individuation. Individuation is the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating all the parts of ourselves, conscious and unconscious, until we can live from the center of our being, which Jung called the self. It is about becoming the person you were meant to be, not the person others expect you to be. But the need to constantly explain ourselves stands directly in the way of this process. Because every time you explain, you are still living under the authority of someone else's approval. You are still measuring your truth against their standards, still asking, is this acceptable? Do you agree with me? Do you understand me? Individuation requires a different kind of posture, one that Jung described as the development of internal authority. Internal authority means that you validate your own feelings and choices without needing external confirmation. It is the shift from, I must explain myself so that you will accept me, to, I accept myself, whether or not you understand. This doesn't mean becoming cold, arrogant, or indifferent to others. It means recognizing that your truth does not need to be negotiated, that your existence does not require permission. This shift may sound simple, but it is radical. It changes the axis of your life. Instead of living on the periphery, always revolving around the gaze of others, your center of gravity moves inward, back to the self. From this place, your decisions are not performances, but authentic expressions. Your emotions are not problems to be explained away, but signals to be trusted. Your boundaries are not things to be justified, but natural extensions of your integrity. Of course, this transition is not easy. It demands courage, because the fear of judgment and abandonment runs deep. To stop explaining yourself means facing the silence that follows, a silence that can feel terrifying, because for so long, explanations were your shield. But Jung believed that this confrontation was essential. Without it, the self remains hidden, and you remain trapped in a role written by others. With it, you begin the true work of individuation. And here lies the paradox. The less you explain yourself, the more whole you become. For in silence, you discover not emptiness, but authority, not absence, but presence. This is the turning point where individuation begins to reshape not only your inner life, but the way you stand in the world. When we think about breaking free from the need to explain ourselves, it's natural to imagine replacing justification with louder words, stronger arguments, or bold declarations of independence. But Jung suggested something quite different. The true opposite of compulsive explanation is not more talking, it is silence. Silence may seem passive at first, like an absence of response, but in reality, it is one of the most powerful forms of authority a person can embody. It communicates without justification, without negotiation, and without seeking approval. It says clearly, I do not need to defend my existence. I simply am. Think about the weight of a simple no that is not followed by excuses. Consider the strength of ending a conversation without giving reasons. Imagine changing your mind and not softening the decision with apologies or rationalizations. These are small acts on the surface, but they carry immense power because they reveal a person who no longer asks for permission to be. They reveal a person who is rooted in their own internal authority. Of course, the first experience of silence is rarely comfortable. When you stop explaining yourself, you immediately confront the old fears that kept you trapped in the habit for so long. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being judged, the fear of being rejected or abandoned. These fears don't vanish overnight. In fact, when you first hold back an explanation, you may feel an almost irresistible urge to break the silence, to fill the gap with words that will reassure others and protect yourself. But this discomfort is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of growth. It means you are stepping out of the performance and into authenticity. Jung believed that silence of this kind is not emptiness but presence. It is not about withholding communication out of spite or arrogance. It is about choosing not to justify what does not require justification. It is about letting your truth stand on its own, without begging for approval. And the more you practice this kind of silence, the stronger your sense of self becomes. Each moment of silence reinforces the message, I am enough as I am. This silence does not push others away. It clarifies your relationships. It reveals who respects your truth and who only stayed because you made yourself easy to control. In this way, silence becomes more than a lack of words. It becomes an active, living declaration of your autonomy and a cornerstone of the authority Jung saw as essential for individuation. When you stop explaining yourself, something subtle but powerful begins to happen in your relationships. Silence becomes more than just the absence of words. It becomes a filter. People who once relied on your constant justifications, who counted on your insecurity and your need to be understood, suddenly feel unsettled. They may push harder at first, demanding the explanations you used to provide so easily, but when they no longer receive them, they often drift away. What once held them close was not mutual respect, but your willingness to submit, to keep convincing, to always make yourself smaller. At first, this can feel like a loss. When relationships shift or dissolve, there is an instinctive fear that you've done something wrong. But Carl Jung reminds us that individuation often requires rupture. The path to becoming your true self is not always smooth or universally accepted. Sometimes it involves letting go of dynamics that no longer serve you, even if they once felt essential. Distancing is not punishment, it is liberation. What falls away under the weight of your silence is precisely what was never authentic to begin with, and this is where the transformation takes root. The people who remain are different. They are not interested in controlling you or in drawing power from your explanations. They do not need you to justify your boundaries, your emotions, or your choices. They accept you because you are, not because you perform. In their presence, you feel lighter, freer, more whole. These relationships are not built on manipulation or dependency, but on mutual respect. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects truth back into your connections. It reveals who values you and who only valued the version of you that could be controlled. This filtering process is not something you control directly. It happens naturally once you stop playing the old role. Silence reorganizes the entire social field around you. The dynamics that relied on your constant self-betrayal begin to collapse, while new connections form, relationships grounded in authenticity, honesty, and equality. It is as if the moment you stop explaining, you begin broadcasting a different signal, one that only certain people can tune into. Silence in this sense is not emptiness, it is clarity. It arranges your world without words. It shows you, often more clearly than explanations ever could, who truly belongs beside you. And in this clarity, something profound emerges, a social life aligned with who you are, rather than who you once felt you had to be. When the habit of over-explaining begins to fade, what replaces it is something Jung understood as psychological integrity. Integrity, in this sense, is not about rigidity or stubbornness. It is about coherence. It is the ability to remain whole, to no longer fragment yourself in order to be liked, accepted, or understood. You stop bending your truth into shapes that please others, and instead, you hold it intact, as it is. Integrity means you are no longer negotiating away pieces of yourself for temporary approval. You are rooted in a deeper consistency, one that does not rely on external validation to stand firm. This shift brings with it a profound sense of relief. For perhaps the first time, you are no longer asking the question, "Am I enough?" Instead, the answer is already present within you. I am. And from that conviction flows a quiet power that is impossible to fake. When you respect yourself enough to uphold your truth, you naturally invite respect from others. People sense it in your tone, in your presence, in the way you move through the world. Respecting yourself radiates outward. It is an energy that reshapes how others respond to you. Psychological integrity shows itself not in grand declarations, but in the subtle decisions of daily life. It is present when you trust your intuition, even when you cannot provide the logical explanation others might demand. It is there when you say, "This doesn't resonate with me," and allow those words to stand without argument, without apology, without backtracking. It is there when you occupy space, whether in a room, a relationship, or a conversation, without shrinking, without performing, and without feeling guilty for simply being in these small but significant ways. Integrity proves to be magnetic. It carries a density that others can feel, even if they cannot describe it. People are drawn to those who are aligned with themselves, because alignment is rare in a world that so often rewards masks, compromises, and endless explanations. Integrity has its own gravity. It communicates without effort, without pleading, without needing to persuade. This is the power of psychological coherence. It does not mean you are inflexible, nor does it mean you refuse to engage with others. Rather, it means you no longer betray yourself for the sake of acceptance. You can still listen, still connect, still compromise when appropriate, but never at the cost of your own wholeness. And when you begin to live this way, others recognize it, often unconsciously. They see that you cannot be easily swayed, manipulated, or diminished, and so they treat you differently. Integrity is the state of being whole. It is the refusal to abandon yourself. And in reclaiming it, you find that you no longer live in fragments, but in unity with yourself and with the world around you. When integrity settles in, something deeper begins to shift, something almost invisible, yet powerful enough to transform the way the world responds to you. Jung believed that the psyche does not operate primarily on words or explanations, but on presence. The energy you carry communicates more than the arguments you make. When you lived in the habit of constant justification, you radiated uncertainty. People could sense your doubt, even when you tried to cover it with logic. But once you no longer feel the need to explain, you begin to radiate authority. It is not arrogance, not aggression, but a quiet clarity that others instinctively recognize. This shift is like changing frequency. Imagine broadcasting on one channel for years, the channel of self-doubt, of trying to be understood, of constantly pleading for permission to exist. Everyone around you tuned into that signal, and your relationships, your work, even your self-perception aligned with it. But the moment you stop explaining, the signal changes. You begin transmitting something different, the frequency of self-respect, of psychological integrity, of unshakable presence. And those who can receive that frequency begin to show up in your life. while those who depended on your old insecurity find they no longer have access. The results can be dramatic. Relationships reorganize themselves, sometimes collapsing if they were built on control or manipulation, sometimes deepening if they were built on genuine connection. In your career, you may notice that people take your voice more seriously, not because you argue harder, but because you speak from alignment. In your inner life, the constant background noise of anxiety begins to soften, replaced by a steady sense of groundedness. There is a paradox here. The less you explain, the more respect you attract. It is not that people suddenly become kinder or more understanding. It is that your presence has changed. You are no longer performing, no longer negotiating, no longer putting your existence on trial. Instead, you embody coherence, and coherence has weight. It is felt even in silence. This energy shift is subtle but unmistakable. You might notice it in the way conversations unfold differently, or in the way others pause before challenging you. You might notice it in the calm you feel when setting a boundary, no longer tempted to cushion it with excuses. What you are emanating now is self-possession, and that changes everything. In the end, this transformation is not about controlling how others see you. It is about how you choose to see yourself. When you stop explaining, you stop seeking permission. And in that act, you begin to embody the simple but radical truth: I am enough as I am. We have now walked through a journey that begins in childhood and echoes all the way into adulthood. It begins with wounds of emotional invalidation, the moments when your feelings were dismissed, minimized, or mocked. From those wounds grows the compulsion to explain yourself, to justify every choice, every mood, every absence, as though your very right to exist depended on the approval of others. That compulsion becomes a prison, keeping you trapped in performances of politeness, in endless arguments for your own legitimacy. But Jung shows us another path. The path of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of reclaiming yourself. And the first step on that path is silence. To stop justifying, to stop pleading, to stop believing that your truth needs an audience in order to be real. In that silence, you rediscover your own authority. You begin to live not as a reflection of others' judgments, but as an authentic expression of your own being. The transformation is not easy. At first, silence feels like loss. Relationships may fracture, some connections may fall away, and fear will whisper that you are pushing people out of your life. But in truth, you are only shedding what was never real. Silence acts as a filter, revealing who values you without conditions and who only stayed because you made yourself small. And what remains, what grows from that space, are connections rooted in respect and honesty. From this silence arises integrity. No longer fragmented, no longer performing, you begin to live in coherence. Integrity does not mean you never bend or that you refuse compromise. It means you no longer betray yourself in the process. It means that instead of asking, "Am I enough?" you begin to live from the answer, "I am." And from this center, something extraordinary happens. Your energy shifts. You no longer emit doubt or submission. You radiate presence, authority, and alignment. The world responds, not because you demand it, but because energy speaks louder than explanation ever could. The invitation is simple, though never easy. Resist the urge to explain. Each time you hold back an unnecessary justification, you reclaim a piece of your soul. You step further into wholeness, further into freedom. Now I leave you with this question. What is the one explanation you are ready to stop giving? Is it about your emotions, your boundaries, or simply who you are? Share it in the comments below, not as a confession, but as a declaration of liberation. If this message spoke to you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more Jungian insights. And remember this, the moment you stop explaining yourself, the world begins to see you differently. Not because you became louder, but because you finally became whole.